Welcome, everyone, to day 5, the final day of our Inclusive Instruction Speaker Series. We are so thrilled to see so many of you who have been with us from the very beginning, and then people who are joining, especially today, to hear from Dr. Fries-Britt, one of the extraordinary resources that we have here at the University of Maryland. I know that I've been looking forward to this talk all week, so I'm not going to take up any more space. I'm going to hand it to Dr. Snyder, do a tiny bit of level setting, and then you can take it away, Dr. Fries-Britt.
Good morning, everyone. And again, it's so nice to see so many folks who have come for our session, our final session today. I'm deeply grateful and honored that Dr. Fries-Britt is here. This is going to be a really interactive conversation. And so we're excited to hear what she has to say. And as you all have done throughout, continue to have the, just to share and to ask questions. This is really that time. Again, please stay unmuted or stay muted rather while Dr. Fries-Britt is speaking. There will be moments for conversation to be had, and also continue to use that chat function. When the slides are not being shown, feel free to use the speaker view. And again, we are excited for this final day to wrap up an extraordinary week. So Dr. Fries-Britt, after you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Schneider. Let me just say, I am deeply appreciative of this invitation. I don't take it lightly to be asked to be on anyone's schedule, because especially this last Zoom year, we all know that we're putting a lot of energy into these spaces. So I know you've had an incredible group of presenters, and I'm honored to be helping you think through what is the meaning of all this as we sort of think about how to apply some of the different concepts and terms and into an action-oriented sort of agenda. My style with you today is going to be, as Dr. Snyder said, very interactive. As I came into this space and I was meeting my other colleagues, Dr. Renzi and also Ms. Lindeman, I really can see that you've got the energy of leaders around you who are really trying to bring a collaborative process. So I feel really excited and feel like I know a lot of you in this space. So I want folks to feel like they can pop in and ask questions. So what I've done, and before we turn to the slides, I just want to say, I want to set a context, a little bit about myself entering this space. I mean, I work on campus. I've been on campus 36 years. But what's important about how I entered this space around these conversations is I actually started my career as an administrator. So there's a deep part of me. I've been a professor longer on the campus for 26, 27 years. But I was a senior level administrator. And I often tell my students, I never thought I'd be a professor. I actually used to think professors, when I worked as a senior level administrator, just didn't make sense to me. I wasn't sure how they were functioning. I didn't understand their rationale for decisions. I have a complete, what I consider 360 view of the academy after 40 something years of my career, in that I bring both lenses. Like, I think I'm a better professor for having been an administrator. And if I ever go back to administration, I know I would be a better administrator for being a professor. And I get a chance to use all of that. So those pieces of my life matter for how I think about this topic. But what you should also know, two other quick things, is that actually the topic of race, equity, diversity work, this engagement has been the longest strand of my career. So what I mean by that is I started doing this work when I was 21 years old, when I was actually advised not to do it. And I've consistently done this work. I share it for this reason. It's evolved, it's changed, it is not static. And what I find today with this new situation we're in, and what I mean by that is the national avalanche of interest now of dismantling oppressive systems, dealing with equity, is people are wanting answers and checklists, like, quick, how do I do this? And I can tell you from all the years of being engaged in that what is most important is that we are okay about understanding that you're not going to have every answer. How do you navigate that spaces of ambiguity? Vulnerability is a part of the repertoire of skills that you have to develop as leaders, and faculty, that it isn't a quick checklist, because just as soon as we think we have something right, we're going to have it wrong if we apply it in a certain context and not be aware of that context. So I really am going to say to you that I often say to people, the longer I've done this work, the more humble it becomes doing the work, because the work is always changing and always evolving as we get more opportunity to get access to each other through our communication abilities, and all different kind of configurations of community and what community means and who individuals are and how their lives are shaped. So you got to, I would argue, we have to be much more open to developing a repertoire of skills so that we have a degree of comfort about how we navigate vulnerable spaces with more success. Okay. So that comes from that piece. The last thing that I want to say as part of the context setting for how I enter the space with you all is it's important for me to say that my identity as a Black woman matters in the most positive ways, but in the most instructive ways. And I own my identity in that sense. That's not the only part of my identity. There's lots of other things that are important to my identity, but that one's important in the sense of I have navigated my career, my life, largely in and outside of higher ed in ways that being who I am and how people interpret what that means is some of what I also have to be able to navigate and negotiate and to use my sources of power around that. So all of that informs some of the ideas and some of the things that I'm going to share with you all. And I encourage you as you're dialoguing and we're having this conversation to share the things that shape you as well. So with that as context, I'm going to get, Carrie, if you wouldn't mind, go ahead. Let's start the slides. Here's how I see the slides. They're not, this is to just get us through, and I'm going to turn to you all because I want us to have an engaging conversation. This is just to set some context and to get to the parts where we start talking about the classroom, about how do we apply these things, or how do we begin to think about how we might apply these things. So I use the title Equity-Oriented Leadership in and outside of the classroom intentionally. I think it is important for us to think about in this current, no matter what and I do a lot of work, by the way, in higher ed, private industry, and federal government. And so I'm in different contexts. And what I think is that we need leadership, and I think of leadership from the bottom up, middle, and top down, that we all ought to understand that we are leading in some capacity in spaces and ways that we're shaping other people's lives. So my colleague and I, who've done some work around this, we see leadership broadly. We think of leadership broadly. Now, I know some people think of it very differently, but I'm just giving you my context. And so this title is about how do we think about ourselves showing up, embracing these topics you've been talking about all week, not just in our classrooms, but as a part of the integration of our lives, how we show up. Because when we can do that, it's easier to actually be better in the classroom. So let's advance and go to the next slide. So here's what we know. Here's what I would argue we know about coming back this fall. There's been a lot of conversations. I've had a number of conversations with national organizations over the summer about returning for the fall and the collective trauma. So if we're doing the work of equity, anti-racism, anti-Blackness, anti-Asian, any of the isms and issues that you've been dealing with, so we're all returning back to what has affected all of us. Collective trauma. You can pick any of the words, right? So that right there says we're going to be in vulnerability. You and I do not know how our students, how our colleagues, or even how we are going to be impacted as the year unfolds. So one way that I know for myself, I'm thinking about the return is to know how am I centering myself and understanding how these issues have affected me, because the internal work we do matters in the external ways we're able to engage our students and to engage our classroom. So be aware that the collective trauma is a very real part of it. And again, I'm going to turn to you in a very few minutes. Let me set up my context. You've been all week, as I understand, been engaged in lots of key learning, and that's what your week has been about. You've heard all kind of terms. I've just got a sampling of some here. Probably talked about equity, unconscious bias, anti-racism, anti-Blackness, intersections of identity, and lots of other terms. Here's what I want to say about the layering of our learning. And again, this goes to what's happening right now in the nation. I see this with Zooming with different organizations and campuses. Everyone's feeling the pressure of having to know what everything means now. Like, it's amazing. I have a lot of senior leaders like, I don't know what critical race theory is. Critical race theory showed up on the news. So everyone's doing quick critical race brush up. And what I would say is it's important to have the key learnings, but allow yourself to understand that this is a marathon. This is not a quick race, that the terms you're learning and that we're all learning have variations on them. Most of the time we're learning these terms and we're just scratching the surface. Like, we're not even going to the layers of understanding these terms. So keep adding to what this week was about for you is what I really want to say. I'm glad that your college has had this concentrated time and you guys have hung in there as a core group, but you should look at those key learnings as the beginning of something you're continuing to add on and have layers of understanding around it. So I have a really very real bias about where we work, and we all work in the same. And I say this bias in lots of places. To work in higher education is, from my perspective, an enormous privilege. I don't care what job you do. I say this to all my students, and I have two in the space. They'll tell you I truly believe this. I said this when I was an administrator, and I say it as a faculty member. Here's the reason why I say it. We are in a space that has such an influence on society, and I think we should take that really dear to heart. So we have a privilege to work in an environment where we're shaping things. We're shaping people, we're shaping policy, we're shaping research, we're one of the largest employers almost in every state in the nation. So we're an entity, we're an organization, a business, an opportunity structure that a lot of people come through. That means if you work in that kind of context, there's some responsibility and ways in which you need to understand what's required in that context. That's not just related to what you teach on or what you research, but in the engagement of the process of higher ed. It is much more comprehensive than just the one slice that we might deal with every day, because you're a representation. You and I are representations of what it means to work at the University of Maryland. The college campuses and higher education is one of the most multi-generational workforces you can work in. Think about that. I mean, you are likely to have, or you can have on a college campus from 20-something-year-olds to 80-something-year-olds in the same place. So we have an opportunity to engage across difference and similarity and engagement with people. And that's why our teaching in the classroom matters. Like, the older I get, I go, wow, okay, I'm learning as much from my students and what they're coming in with, and reconceptualization of issues and things I might have studied 20, 30 years ago that I have not been as up on, that maybe even some of them are up on. And so it's a bi-directional learning in a multi-generational space. And so I already brought in the role of higher ed in that conversation. So for me, that's context before we get to how do we apply everything that you have learned. One other thing about multiple levels of learning that I want to say is that I really think before we start having this conversation about how do we apply this, is to understand that your learning is happening on all kinds of levels. And I'm depicting it here as if it's a reverse triangle. You could easily say, I've seen iterations where people have done this in a cyclical way, like a circle. But the point is this, that you and I, you've been learning, and you've learned way before this week, obviously, right? We all enter this space with lots of learning. But we ought to continue to ask ourselves, where have we applied and expanded our learning? Is it in the individual level? Are we sometimes... I'm going to pick on faculty for a minute because I've seen this with us. I think, and I've actually called this out with our own professoriate in the College of Education pretty publicly. I made a comment, so I feel comfortable picking on us in this regard. I've seen our students do a better job of pressing their learning around DEI issues, anti-racism issues, and teaching us in a faculty, in a community meeting assembly with more skilled ability than even we think we can do it, because they've been willing to continue to learn. And so sometimes at the individual level, we have to say to ourselves, when we get these degrees or we get these positions, are we still investing in our own individual learning? And I think that's sometimes challenging outside of our disciplinary domains to push ourselves, but also learning about stakeholder groups. Or who do we know about? Who are we engaging with? How expansive is that? And then, of course, the systems we're in, and then the larger historical, political, social context. So there's so many levels that I would encourage you. That's why this is a marathon. It's not a quick sprint. It's not a checklist. It is an engagement and a commitment that says, I am now going to commit part of the work I do, that it's in alignment and not marginalized around this topic, so that it's more integrated. There's just a couple other things I want to set up around organizational learning, but this is a good break before I talk about application. But let me just pause and see, are there any comments, reactions, or questions that may have caused or interest folks in at this point? So let me just pause for a second. Anything that I have said about, the early part of like going into this with a mentality of being open, being able to deal with the vulnerability of the space, before we get to the things that I think are important to think about in the classroom transition.
While folks are thinking, there was a comment in the chat, and Wendy was saying that she's been thinking a lot about how long-term impact of life-altering events such as 9/11, we're coming up on the 20th anniversary, kind of what that has done as she started her career. And then, we think about all of the other traumatic events that have been happening even most recently. So thank you for offering that.
Absolutely. And even if they don't affect us the same way, it's being aware of how they might affect another part of our community. And I think sometimes that's the more challenging part, is that if we're not directly impacted, it's realizing, somebody else may be seriously impacted by this. And COVID was a big example of that when I thought about how many, and I know, Jeanette, you and I had this conversation. I could count 12 people half of whom I personally knew in the Black community who died this year, including a sibling of mine who came into my life later, but a family member. And so I was talking to other colleagues who had no experience of that. And that's just a very different kind of impact of how a COVID thing might hit versus 9/11 or any incident?
I was just thinking that for me, I was like 24, I guess, when 9/11 happened. And it was the first sort of major, as an adult, the first sort of major, like, huge sense of people turning against one group of people for their ethnicity, right? Like the backlash against Muslim Americans and how scared they were. And that was the first time I really saw that as an adult. And we look at our students now, and so many of them weren't even born then, right? And so they don't understand the long-term impact of that. But for so many of them, what's happened over the last year is really their first big major thing of seeing something as adults about what has, happened. And so I give context to think how much that affected me over the last 20 years, and thinking about how all of this and how they're going to make sense of everything that's been happening to them for the next 20 years.
Absolutely. Wendy, do you share that with your students? You're in the classroom teaching, right?
I am, yes.
How do you?
Because I've just really been thinking about it a lot as we come up on the 20th anniversary, because part of me thinks I can't possibly be that old that it happened 20 years ago. I mean, I've just finished graduate school, so I just finished graduate school 3 weeks ago. So how can that possibly have happened? But I have been thinking about it a lot. And so, I possibly will discuss that with them, because it definitely does. I hadn't thought about Muslim Americans. I was just like, these people are in my class and they sit next to me and it doesn't matter to me. And so I was so surprised I was so idealistic. And so I was so surprised at everything that happened, and I feel like a lot of them are in the same boat.
Before we go to Dean Mullins, let me just say, because this is directly connected to how do we make this stuff, the rubber hit the road, I actually would highly encourage you to find your voice on that for your class, because that's what opens up the space for them to see, we've lived life, we're approachable, we've learned. You really should share. And you can even say, it wasn't until the summer and I was in a week session with my colleagues in the college that I was really giving this more thought, because what students are looking for is the signs from us that we're bigger than, that we are capable of handling and open to a discussion that's bigger than just our subject matter. And in many ways, our subject matter dovetails with this work, and sometimes it doesn't, but that it's okay to do that. They're empowered to do that. And that we show that is showing some of your own vulnerability and being very specific about the spaces that opened up in you that you're still learning about. It isn't that you have this all solved. So I think the fact that you use that as an example is the exact kind of examples that speak from the heart, that allow us to be human to our students in ways that we're more approachable and that they can learn in the exchange of that process. So I highly encourage you and anyone else, even if you haven't had an incident, this is your first incident, to give words to that. That's part of developing the repertoire of skills of talking about it. Dean Mullins, I know you've got some great advice for us.
Well, actually, you validated a point for me, and because I've always been a quick, let's just get this done type of person. How can we solve this in the easiest and quickest way? And so I'm teaching myself that it's a marathon. It's going to take a long, it's going to take a time to get to the point where we want to be. And I think that it's important for us to also definitely communicate that to our professors and our peers here in the business school and across the campus. I've been meeting with so many professors that will tell you confidentially they don't want to be, let me know, let people know at the school, and it's good. But I will tell you the thing that you had said about this is an individual, how committed are you to your own individual learning? Mm-hmm. That was, I like that. I think that in what we're trying to do, just so that people can know, is we're having these small group dialogues with faculty. I mean, when I say small group, it's like 2 to 3 people to continue to talk about these issues. And I think the next time that we do this, I want to mention that I think it's transactional right now. It's sort of like, how can I teach? And just give me the 4 things so I can teach better, as opposed to let's stop and breathe for a moment and focus on you for a moment. What does this mean for you as you go in and teach supply chain? So that was a wake-up call for me this morning. So thank you for that.
Oh, absolutely. And you're going to see when we go, this is why I took a break in between this and the next slide, because I was rolling, is that the next continuum is really about the fact that we're balancing the individual with the organizational learning process. So that's exactly why I wanted to pause here, because what I've seen in my experience in the field is that a lot of the individual learning, I think, has not necessarily, it's been focused on student growth and focused on staff growth, not as much on faculty growth in their, I don't mean in their fields, I mean in this topic area, and seeing that this is not an add-on, that this actually helps to enhance the ability of not just departments and units, but the university and even our own professional abilities, because who's coming to our classrooms, who's coming to our universities, again, the relationship between higher ed society are individuals who are looking for our learning processes and our learning context, the collaboration in the classroom to also grow and expand like they're pushing it largely in society. So we have to learn, we have to grow as faculty. So I'm glad that resonated with you. It only makes sense, but I think it's so easy to stay within our disciplinary growth and not expand into some of these other areas and see how meaningful they can be to really making our universities better places, stronger places. Anybody else?
I really appreciate what you said, and I'm trying to be in this place where I'm learning, because I think I can, and I talked with Darren and some others about this yesterday, where I feel the gender stuff a lot, but that's because it applies to my life, right? Mm-hmm. And I have, anyway. And so I face that, and I see the people in front of us who've done the work that I didn't acknowledge before. I'm wondering how we can encourage other people to do the work as well, because what I faced a little bit, if you have any thoughts on that, right? So, I faced a little bit of pushback, and that's what I'm nervous about when I try to share that I think it's important to learn, or that I'm trying to learn, and these are the things that I'm facing. I face, well, we can't change it like that, Julie, and I think for us to learn individually, it takes the institution to change. And I think you kind of said that a little bit, and I'm not clear how to communicate that or how to help with that part of it. And I don't know if that's off. I'm not sure I'm saying this right, or if it's off where you're going, but I found that kind of, I saw that in kind of what you were saying. That's what I
first
said.
of all,
Yeah.
Julie, you're saying it beautifully. You're also doing one of the things that I say as a normative factor, and you're going to see this when I get to the other part of the list, that we have to give each other the permission to think out loud in these spaces, to speak in draft form. And so you actually just modeled that, because what we worry about is being perfect or getting it right, and none of us have it. Okay. So if we were doing a quote workshop sort of thing, one of the first things I would say is let's give each other the permission to think out loud. And you displayed that beautifully. And you also are capturing the issues beautifully, because yes. And so I think I'm going to get to what you're talking about in a very few minutes. And the short answer, though, you may not be happy with the resolution. I don't think it's an easy resolution, because the nature of this work, when we're deeply committed, is we are up against the grain. So let me just say this. But right now, as in right now, what I mean is where we are nationally. I mean, again, in doing this work, this is the best season I've ever been in, because I call it a national classroom. So when I'm out, before Zoomland, but even in Zoomland, this is the first time in my career of doing this work where I call it a national classroom, because I don't have to convince the class, the people, that why this is happening. So there's been a lot of the incidents that are why it's happening, but you still have what you're describing, which is different degrees of microclimates and micro ways in which people are invested or not invested in this topic. And so we do run up against that. I run up against it all the time. Even though my college is now moving more in the right direction, for sure. Dean Rice, who's now our provost, who is deeply committed to these issues, gets it and is moving. But that doesn't mean every faculty member in our college gets it, right? Or want to get it, or think it's even important. So you're still entering. So my bottom line answer is, you're going to get that. And you should, I've learned to accept, I have my own SFB, Sharon Fries-Britt formula. It's called 50% of people ain't going to like you, because they're not going to like what you got to say or how you're going to push them. And 50% might. And I'm okay with that, because I'm still at the core going to do the work I do. And so I don't need to have a fan club event. Now, I'm not saying you do. What I mean is, we're going to have to develop a skin that says, hey, these folks aren't going to like me, but I'm going to say some of the tough stuff that needs to be said. And eventually, over time, here's the interesting thing. You get momentum, because if you are doing it for the right reasons, and your lived experience as a woman, because I heard you say gender in there a little bit, what you're dealing with, which means it's not just you. And that's part of a truth that has to be understood. If we're trying to dismantle oppressive systems, you keep that language going, even if your colleagues can't see the importance of it. We're not going to win popularity contests initially, but in the long run, the integrity of that work matters. The integrity of that work means that's how systems change. So stay with it. You have to stay with it long enough to sort of see the fruits of your labor, that it's not going to happen overnight. And you're creating a pathway and walking on a pathway that others have helped build, but you're also now helping to smooth out that pathway in your ways of still saying, hey, I get that you don't see this, but you need to understand I live it every day, or whatever that truth is for you, if you know what I mean. But this is a perfect question in transition. So you were right on target. So let's go back to the slides. We only have a couple more of these, and then we can continue this kind of dialogue. So this is what I was suggesting was going to come up, that as Dean Mullins was saying, on the one hand, I paused on the individual learning as part of that multi-level learning. But I think we're in a season right now where simultaneously multiple things need to happen. And this gets to my colleague's comment that, yes, individuals can invest and do a lot of learning, but organizations have to do their work and learn and change. And that is not something we've been invested in doing. And it's interesting. And I started using this work in the last year more. And actually, even in the class that I teach, I brought up, I think, Jillian, you might have been in that class. I'm losing count of semesters, but the leadership course, Bia, you were in there. I think both of you might have been. But do we talk about the literature and the discourse around organizational learning? But I've been using it in my consulting work and in my practice work in the field, because what's happening is colleges and universities in various ways want this equity, dismantling of oppressive systems work done like yesterday. I won't name colleges, but there's some top universities who just put out, like, we're going to eliminate racism. And I laugh. I say, okay, good. I hope I live long enough to see this, because this has been embedded in our society, but I'm glad we're moving in that direction. So the question is, what are you doing organizationally to make this happen? And so just to give you a small precursor on organizational learning, and organizational learning is a decent body of literature. It's not where I do my work all the time, but I've turned to that body of scholarship. But organizational learning, and I know there's probably some of you in the group here who probably do more work on this, and certainly in the business school. The way I've been applying it is that to help people understand that organizations have to be committed to a process where they're actually learning together. Like, in some ways, what you went through this week and what you're building in your college of processes to engage in the organization around topics, that is a shared experience where your cohort this week has been going through this learning, and the exchange and everything isn't going to feel comfortable for everybody, because that's a part of the growth. But you're having this engagement where there's shared knowledge and experience in ways that people are learning from each other. And over a period of time, not even a week is enough, but it's a commitment. And this is where the marathon comes in. It doesn't mean that it takes forever to see change, but you have to be invested differently. And that's actually sometimes very challenging for us in higher ed, because where are we going to find the time? How do we do this? I can't add that on. So it's figuring out the creative ways of how leaders, our deans and our associate deans and our presidents, et cetera, and chairs build that time into an agenda. But when you do that, you actually prepare and have the potential for more effective action within your unit. But there has to be that shared experience. There has to be this shared learning, shared understanding, so that it increases everyone's ability to have more options and choices and behaviors. And that's where we're getting to as you close out this week. So how do we take all this stuff and move it in the direction of change? And change doesn't happen if only you and I at the individual level do a lot of learning and then come into a room in a space and think that our individual learning can somehow map on and make a collective learning. It has to be a shared collective learning. And that's where organizational learning is different. And so there are organizations like your own and others that are taking intentional time and realizing, as Dean Mullins just said, this is going to take some time. This first year, the second year, our college is going through the same thing. And it has to be done in different waves, and it has to be done in different contexts. So one thing I want to say as we talk about the classroom, because we're moving to the last slide that I have to share with you in a few seconds. So don't turn to share, Carrie. I want to, as we talk organization, in fact, let me go to you all for a second. When I say organization, let me ask you all, what parts of the organization come to mind for you at the University of Maryland? What does it mean for you when you hear the word organization? When I say the organization needs to do learning, what comes to your mind? What is organization for you?
We've got some answers in the chat there, Dr. Fries-Britt. So
what did they say?
Smith undergrad programs across campus, the Smith School of Business, a collective group of faculty, staff, students, and leadership, and decision-making units.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. Anybody else? Wonderful examples. So
well, in addition to Smith, I'm going to add provost, leadership, president's office, everybody else.
Exactly. Right. I knew they were going to come in there. So here's the point. How we think of organization is huge. So big O, little o, there's lots of levels of organizational learning potential, right? So what's going to happen in all these different contexts. And that is why this work really matters oftentimes where you work on a campus, often defines your experiences with DEI. Because if you work in a unit where the leader is attending to these issues and engaging in certain ways, that's a very different experience if you're in a unit where it's almost like it never comes up unless someone from on high says you have to turn in a strategic plan. So oftentimes on college campuses, because we're often siloed or very unique and distinct the organization can mean lots of different things. So part of on this scale, we're doing this in a very surface way this morning, is I want you to understand that there's lots of ways in which organizational learning can be occurring. And therefore, I want you to think of small or our students, when our students come in, depending on how we socialize them to the academy and how they are socialized to the academy. Like Bia's still here, she's still here. So when I first met Bia in person, it was actually at lunch, but when I met her in the Zoom space, I learned that her parents are academicians, right? Your dad's an engineer. So your orientation to the academy happened, we talked about this. So it happened before she came to classes, right? She had already kind of had a sense of the organization of university. She grew up as a professor's kid. So she kind of had a sense of that. That's not the typical case for a lot of students, right? So their orientation to our field or to the academy is sometimes nested in that classroom. It's nested in their interaction with you before they understand they're even in a program or a department. Most of them know they're in a program. And, obviously for Bea and Jillian, they came in as master students. So they have an orientation to the academy. And I'm teaching, like probably many of you all, graduate students. But at the undergraduate level in particular, particularly for a lot of our first generation students, for a lot of our students whose parents or low income backgrounds, and even those whose parents have been to college, by the way, but been to college a long time ago, and the collegiate context has changed. So the organizational context learning, and this is what I want to get to before we go to the last slide, is I often think of the organization of my class as an opportunity to build community, an opportunity to weave in these topics, even if they're not what I'm teaching about, although there's always strands of it in my work. But I make them happen in ways because I know they're connected to our lives. They're connected to my students' representation. So think of your classroom as part of the organizational structure you're strengthening at this university. So what you do in the classroom is going to matter for that student's experience in the department, in the program. The students could tell you that better than any of us could do of what their experience feels like. And that is partly how many of our students then develop their sense of understanding of, if they have a good interaction with the faculty and understand their program, and then there's a college and the college does things, and then a university system. So the organization for you as a professor or you as an administrator may be all these things we listed, but for many of our students, it just might be your program in that classroom. And we know from research that the classroom is the common ground of students. It's the required place. They come to college to go to class, right? So ultimately, it is the common denominator. They're going to show up in somebody's class, and it's not all about, even though obviously living in the residence hall and the extracurricular stuff is incredibly important, the classroom is the common space. And since most of our students are commuters and not living on campus, that is where faculty matter in what we do in that classroom and how we distribute and think about uses of power and creation of community. So with that, I'm going to go to the last slide, and then we're just going to have a dialogue the rest of the ride. So let's talk specifically some ideas that I would like to share about how I think we begin to think about employing and growing ourselves, our repertoire of skills around this, and what we can do to be intentional. One is, I think we have to re-employ our use of power as professors, eliminate oppressive systems. And what that means for me is there are ways that we have to be willing to assume some risk, okay? This is not without risk, in the sense that not every student's, and what I mean by risk is people have written about this, like, oh, how's it going to affect my evaluation? And I know for untenured faculty, that can feel very scary, like, ooh, I don't know that I'm comfortable with that. So I'm going to try to make sure everybody's comfortable, so my evaluations are high, or we think that's going to make our evaluations high. But to be engaged in this work means that we have to assume some degree of risk of how we approach this. And so one thing that I would say, and I'm looking at my notes real quick because I had a couple lists on here. One is, I do think it is important, one way we can redistribute and reemploy our power is that even if you're teaching a class that you think is unrelated to what's happening in society and that's issues of DEI issues that are unrelated, we still have the ability to frame that world and say, listen, I want to pause for a minute and just recognize that we're dealing with a lot in our society. And on the face of it, it may look like it doesn't relate to this topic. But as a person who teaches this, knowing that you all are entering this classroom space as folks who are affected in ways that I may not fully understand, I want to take some time to just sort of clear our space or open up our space for us to just kind of put out how this may be. So opening up the space for that, you have the power to do that. You have the power to say to students, we still got to do our topic and our work, and we're going to move off of this. You could also decide that you're going to create other opportunities to process things with students. But the extent to which you can connect it to what you do, if it is connected, and I think there's a lot of ways to connect it, you should try to do that and build that in. So that's number one. And we'll come back to any of these. Quickly, number two is I think it's important to advance knowledge that centers the experiences of minoritized communities in our teaching and research. So if you are able to do that, you should do that. So if it's selecting authors and readings and work that shows a range of talent in your field, you should do that. You should find out who those folks are and what they're writing about, include examples of that so that you're getting a range and how they're approaching topics. And also if there are examples you use, and again, I know folks teach in lots of different areas, try to find examples that are diverse examples of the things that you're doing. And I'm sure others have talked about this week. We talked a lot about strengthening your own self-awareness and expanding your skills, so I won't extend on that more, except for to say, have a trusted group of advisors, even if it's just one other person that can help you check yourself. Like we all have to continue to check ourselves because none of us are doing this completely right for everybody. I mean, there's going to be somebody that we're not engaging in ways that make them feel empowered. So we have to keep strengthening our awareness. I think faculty in particular, and this is when I do a lot of work in STEM fields, I do my research on, big part of my research on students of color in STEM fields. So I interact with a lot of STEM faculty, and I've heard for years, like, that's not what we do. I teach physics this or engineering that. And it's unrelated to DEI. There's been national work through the American Association of Universities and Colleges that have showed disciplines how to apply this work, that it is applied. I stop assuming that it's only for people who do DEI work, because we all do DEI work, whether you think you're doing it or not. Even if it's not in your teaching, it's in your interaction and in your approaches and in your way of engaging students is a part of equity. It's a part of who you call on, who you acknowledge, whose work. So it's not just about your teaching, it's about the fullness of how you are showing up in your work. One of my favorite is, how do we norm the culture of our classrooms in collaboration with our students? So how do we set some norms of how we're going to engage with each other? For me, it's different in different classes. When I teach the professional seminar, I like to tell them you're going to be each other's major network. And so I reinforce for them that, you may not like this person this year. You may say how they got in the program, but they're going to be your network. So, we laugh and talk about it, but it's very serious that you don't have to like, but everyone has talent and capability and got in our program because they have skills. So I norm my classes and ask students to participate in that process in a variety of different ways. Again, different for different classes. But to be more specific, I think it's important to have a standard as a professor in the classroom to say, we're going to be engaging on a wide range of topics. What is it that you want them to understand? Like I said to my colleague, permission to think out loud. When I'm doing workshops, I have those, but in the classroom, how do we open up that space? And even if you don't do it all at the front end, it's up to us to be aware of what's happening in our class and bring it back, like watching our students' faces and energy on this Zoom space this last year. I know the students can be very engaged, but they were exhausted. And there were times where I kept checking in, maybe not as much as I should have, to say, am I reading it right or wrong? Or is this working? So norming and renorming, I think, is important. I also think we as faculty, you've heard me use the word vulnerable several times. I think we can't expect our students to give examples and be vulnerable if we're not willing to be vulnerable. So I think we're in the best position. I actually see vulnerability as really a restoration of power. That sounds crazy, but we have a lot of power and capability to be vulnerable, I think, to be able to say, like, what are we going to be able to do it appropriately, but to be able to say, I'm still struggling with this. I say this all the time. I mean, in my class, I'll if I'm upset about something, they know. I'll say, I'm struggling this week because of George Floyd watching that murder. Like, we process that. Like that, I'm not going to come in the classroom and act like I'm just going to teach y'all about organizational development today. No, I've got feelings, and you need to know, because if I don't deal with that, it's going to impact how I am trying to teach. And what I find is that always opens up. So being vulnerable when you're a professor is helping to teach and teaching our students how to be okay about the realities of things that we're dealing with in our society. And again, it doesn't have to absorb and take up your whole class. And we can talk in a few minutes about other ways to do that. And my seventh one up here is, I do think we have to have the courage to speak up. Like, we do have to, both in and outside of the classroom. And it goes to Julie's point about, when we speak up, there's a cost sometimes for that. There's pushback, but it takes courage to do that. And I think, even though I said we have to have the courage to speak up and we should do that, I also think we have to monitor how much of our energy we're using on that. So, for example, it isn't our job to be the only one speaking up. It isn't our job to consistently always do that. So when, I think, Julie, I'm hoping I remember your name correctly, when she said that, there are times where it's absolutely okay to not speak up, to say, they know my opinion on this, I'm stepping back. Like, you have to reserve some of that energy, and create the space for other people to actually step up, and to call people out on that when appropriate, in the right ways, maybe not publicly, but privately, to say, hey, you're coming to me on the side to tell me you agree. I need you to do that in the public space. So, there's so many people who will, when you speak up and you put yourself on the line, they will call you or come afterwards. And, while that may sound like that's okay, you got to let them know, I need you when it's happening. I don't need you to come comfort me at the aftermath. So I'm going to pause. I'm going to stop there. I'm going to go back to the full gallery. Let's have a conversation about what's on your mind about specifics in, or any aspects of this, and share with each other what your strategies have been. I don't think anyone else's strategy means it necessarily has to be yours, because I do believe that there has to be an authentic way that you deal with these issues. And for each of us, it's different. For some of us, I know for myself, I'm always dealing with these issues. So my skill comfort is different in some ways, but also still cautious in some settings.
I wanted to get back to this discussion that you had about vulnerability. And yes, I've been teaching for so many years that it has always been ingrained in me, particularly in the business school. You don't get political, right? You try to stick to the topics. You don't get political. You don't get drawn into political arguments. And it seems to me that this is sort of venturing into that area, being vulnerable and saying, hey, this is what's going on today, and having an opinion about it and speaking out. And I just want to say that this is going to be a little tough for me, only because for so many years, I have kept those two separate when it comes to the classroom. I'm Switzerland in the classroom. I will let the students say what they want to say, but I don't say that's good, that's bad. I make absolutely no decision in that way. So this is going to be an area that's brand new to me.
So thank you so much for saying that, because a couple of things I want to comment on. One is the culture of our organizational context we work in does matter. And so we get socialized, and what you're describing is being socialized exactly as you just described. But I would also suggest that raising it doesn't mean you're giving an opinion. It means that you're giving an opportunity for what is actually factually real. You may still be uncomfortable. I'm not saying you should. And if you're uncomfortable doing it, you may not want to do it. And in fact, interestingly enough, depending on the classroom and the context, what you just shared with us is an important thing to also share. To say, things are changing. I was socialized and I'm still uncomfortable with this. But what I realize is that we ought to allow room for all of us, or anyone who wants to share their perspectives, especially if it's related to a topic you're teaching. And let me just go one step further. You're sharing what you just shared with us is the actual toe in the water of growth that says, I was trained to keep these two separate, and I'm still inclined to do that because, I'm not sure I'll ever feel fully comfortable having a full-fledged conversation because it'll feel to me like I am taking a side or being whatever the language is that's right for you, Kathy. But just in saying that the field is, I don't even know that your field is changing, but it may be changing. I don't know if new faculty coming in or new folks are, but if that's true, you should say that. Say, I was educated and socialized and taught this way, but what's happening now, and especially if it's happening in your field, you should give a counter to say this is, and that's that multi-generational opportunity and life changes to say, wow, I've been teaching long enough that it's changing and I'm thrown off my game a little bit. That's the vulnerability. That's the conversation. That's authentic. And that doesn't mean you have to now come in every day and spill your guts. But you have told your students enough so that they know who you are and why you might be behaving the way you are. So in other words, your silence isn't totally interpreted as disinterest, but rather it's, oh, this is how. And so you can still teach from that to say, I'm struggling and I'm not sure before I retire, I'll get this the way people are expecting it. But I know many of you are in classrooms or in our field. What part of business are you in? What's your field?
Oh, it ranges, but for this college, it's marketing.
Okay, so yes, and marketing, the little I know about marketing, you're trying to attract certain people. So you're trying to be Switzerland for a lot of people, right? So everybody, whatever. So however you can fashion it to fit, the truth telling, the vulnerability doesn't mean you have to change everything, but it means you can still teach the transition you're seeing, even if you're not going to make it. And you're seeing it in the field, which means I don't know if if it is happening in your field and people are, it is happening because look at what's happening in our society. People are marketing products and they're saying, no, I care about Black Lives Matter. And so businesses are having to adjust. And it's just being in a line with demonstrating the shift and talking about the shift. And what does that mean? And you should spend more time, or you can do, my suggestion is grapple with that more. You should grapple with that on your own without conversation, maybe with your colleagues, trusted colleagues, maybe find in your field, how is it moving? How are people thinking about this? And use that as ways that you begin to have a way to talk about it, not be expected to jump full throttle into it. Because I think that's a beautiful example of you were socialized differently and it takes time. This is not easy. And that is accurate. I like that you said that way. I think that's because that's your truth.
Yes. Yeah.
Pratiti, do you want to go?
Actually, I don't. I had the same question that Kathy did. Basically, like, I teach strategy and I keep a middle ground and I don't have an opinion and I don't address any of that. So thank you for that. That really helped. So I have to go back and do a little bit more work and figure out how to bring it into the classroom. So
can I ask a quick question to you? Is it that you don't have an opinion or you don't want to say your opinion?
I don't want to say my opinion and I don't want to alienate someone. Gotcha. And, Switzerland, she described it beautifully, right. Switzerland. Right. And I also always thought that I'm teaching strategy. They're here to learn strategy. And, right. If they wanted to learn about politics, they'd go to the politics class or whatever. And I shouldn't mess with the core concepts, so to say. But there is a way to bring it in. And I just have to do the homework Absolutely. To bring it in.
Because actually you've used a strategy in teaching strategy, not to employ your politics. So I don't teach strategy, so I don't know about strategy. But there's great ways that you can still think through and tease out. Again, use the field as the leveraging. Use all this change as the leverage, not necessarily. Yeah. And opening the space doesn't mean, although in some fields, like in education, we do this work more intentionally, right? So we do say, not every professor, and I don't always say where I fall out on things, although it's probably pretty obvious to my students where I fall out on some things, but some things would not necessarily. But what I find important is creating a safe space for those who don't agree with my perspective. And I know I do that. Like I want to hear from the students who see it very differently, because that's how we're going to learn. Like that, and I've had students over the years and colleagues for sure, that I need to be able to listen and learn from that so that I can better understand where they're coming from, and learning how to lead in environments where I don't expect everyone to have that same opinion. So we can still open that space, and it's how we create it so that people feel okay, and to be able to have different opinions. But this was very helpful to hear you all say that, because your field socializes you to be Switzerland more.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Even online, especially online, we go through, don't do all caps, don't get upset, be nice to your fellow student. We're very careful about how they interact with each other because we don't want to have alienation going on. And as a professor, because we're in a position of power, I feel I need to be very careful not to necessarily bring my politics to the front, because I don't want to overly influence somebody. Although I would like to, but there's a part of me that says, no, I have to be fair and even and hear both sides.
So let me push a little bit harder to say this. So when we are planning our classrooms with that as the sort of scale, we're really privileging white ways of behaving, because it doesn't allow for emotional energy. It doesn't allow for people who are experiencing in the classroom. So let me be specific. There could be something said in your classroom or something done in your classroom that's very oppressive and very racist that never gets addressed if we're worried about making sure everybody likes each other in the class.
Oh, and no. That's different.
Okay, good. You will address that. Tell me about that. How do you address that? Tell me how you do that. Tell me how that shows up.
Fortunately, I have never had that experience come up, but I think I make it very clear to my class that we are there to communicate, collaborate, and we respect one another. I've never had a student come up and be brazenly racist, nasty, or whatever. Now, what goes on in the back of the classroom that I don't hear or don't see, sadly, I can't do much about. But no. That doesn't mean that it's a free-for-all. Oh, good. By no means.
Okay, no. Well, and that's why I want to be a little bit provocative with it for this standpoint. It isn't I think the obvious stuff we might see, but it's even just the nuance othering of people, like sometimes it's subtle stuff. But if it's not happening in your class, because it sounds like you norm very well. Sounds like you're norming your class, you're setting up conditions, and that's all great. But what I'm also saying is that when we don't, not inviting, not the politics. I don't want this to assume like it's all politics, because I think politics has become one of the ways in which people assume any topic is political. I don't think they're all political. It's the inequities or the challenges that we're dealing with across a lot of domains that I'm inviting us to be okay about raising, right? And so if politics is what you want to keep out of it, keep out of it. But there's still ample other examples out there of things. So just pulling in other issues that shows and recognizes some of the disparities and the inequalities that are happening in our society. So it doesn't have to be political, I guess is what I'm saying. I think political has now taken over a lot of our concern, but that doesn't have to be the example we go to. We can go to the factual data around disparities in our fields or other things as things to bring in the classroom to raise awareness, if you know what I mean. So stay out of the political lane if that's the lane that. Yeah. Data is very important. In fact, everything that a lot of us do, we put data up there. Whether or not our students buy into that, and this is a very sad thing to say, but I've seen everything's gotten so politicized lately, it's really hard sometimes to teach. But when they actually start questioning, Bureau of Labor Statistics and things like this, it's a challenge. It's a challenge. Yeah. And you know what? That's a better example, too, of where I think that's where the risk comes in. That so when we know as a professor, I would say if I'm showing you data that comes from the Department of Labor Statistics, and this is the data, and that's okay for everyone to have their ideas about it, but to be stern about reinforcing that you're pulling the best data that we have available, and that these are you don't have to argue with that student, which I'm sure you don't need to, but to reinforce that these are legitimate points of data, and they're data that have informed our understanding in this nation on XYZ. I think reinforcing that is important as professors, to not cave into the politics of where'd you get your data. You can say where you got it, but this is data that is very valid and very real. To me, that's part of the risk taking that's important for us to be able to take to in our classrooms in this current time. I'm sure it is very hard, and I'm sure you probably get students who raise those issues. I know that for a lot of faculty, and I see the literature in the body of scholarship on faculty of color around this, there's pushback on almost just being in the classroom for us, like just being present. Sometimes people feel a license to push back and counter and argue against every aspect of what we're presenting. And I know there's been lots of dialogue about how do we handle that? How do we deal with that? And I personally feel like that's not a challenge for me to deal with. I have a standard of, I'm not going to be disrespected if in a classroom, and I'm not giving you disrespect, I'm not going to accept disrespect. And I've had those conversations with colleagues who say, wow, students are just yelling at me or doing that's not something that we allow. And I'm sure, Kathy, Dr. Kelly, you don't allow that either in your classroom. But there are some faculty, particularly when they're untenured and not sure, who think that that's okay for them to have to weather before they get tenured. And I just disagree with that that's not an appropriate way to deal with the classroom context. Thank you, Dr. Kelly, for that great question, engaging conversation. We'll just close out. Let's go to the last slide. Let's just close out. And then I can hang out for a few minutes if folks have questions they want to ask, if you all can hang out. But if you need to go, please go. Just very quickly, this last slide, because you'll get them if you want them later, is I do think there's a lot of key challenges in this work in negotiating power and politics. Organizational support for this work ebbs and flows. That's kind of the conversation we were just having. The power and politics of doing this work is always front and center. And so it is not easy. We're all going to make different choices. Operating oftentimes, if we're doing this kind of work with insufficient financial and human resource support. So how do we actually get the materials and things that we need to do this is very challenging. And so that's a big part of it. And then just the lack of appreciation of the complexity of this work, DEI work, and the skills required to be effective. And, just even that last conversation about how comfortable people need to feel in our classrooms or in these conversations. And sometimes we level to the point of worrying about who's going to be upset that we almost don't get the next level of growth. And so it's not just in the classroom, it's in and outside of the classroom. And I think as we're continuing to do this work, we're going to have to push ourselves to be a little bit more comfortable with, because that's where the growth is going to happen. It's not going to all feel comfortable. We got to be outside of that comfort zone a little bit. And then the last key challenge, I think, is that the discourse around whose story get told, so the narrative and the counter storytelling, is, I think, really important. The words we use, the language we use, who gets centered in our classrooms to speak in our departments, who has the authority, who's seen as having the authority in these conversations, even amongst, if we're in the classroom context, who do we call on? Who do we affirm? Certainly that spills out into departmental culture and college culture as well, and university culture, like who are the faces that are before us, who are giving a counter narrative that is also still a very truthful narrative and a very authentic narrative. So as you keep doing this work, I encourage you to have patience with it and to keep invested in it. It's very important. And again, none of us are going to have the same exact path and way of doing it. But I think in the process of doing something, you're going to develop a stronger sense of capability. And to me, that is worth the journey to do that. So thank you so much. Sorry we went over, but I am happy to hang out for a few minutes if folks have a question after. Thank you. Give yourselves, you had a long week, so great week.
Also, please do not apologize for sharing wisdom. That is not something I ever want anything to apologize for. So we've got the recording for folks, and if people can stay, they can go ahead and ask some questions while you're still able to.
I've got a couple minutes for sure.
I always want to speak. People would probably be very surprised to learn that I'm actually an introvert. Really, truly, actually an introvert. I question. It's interesting to me because I had a career in industry for a lot of years before becoming an educator. And I was encouraged to share my opinion, especially teaching through the elections of 2016 and 2020 and how all that played into marketing. So I teach marketing and the marketing of candidates. There's a huge body of literature on marketing and public policy, like all of that kind of stuff. And I was encouraged to share, but to model for students how to share productively in grown-up conversations, not about arguing, but about really, having productive conversations. And I would tell students all the time, like, it's totally, and to create a safe space to say to students, it's totally okay for you not to agree with me. I'm totally fine with you not agreeing with me, but I'm going to ask you why you don't, because I want to know how you've processed through that and of course, it comes to critical thinking. I taught at a liberal arts school, so critical thinking was a huge, huge thing. It's about, I want to know your processes. Where have you gotten your information? How are you learning this? Not that you're just spitting out information that somebody, has ingrained in you, but you're actually an adult. And for a lot of kids, those elections are the first time they ever voted. So, teaching them about really developing their own opinions. So it's kind of interesting, the whole, like, I've heard several, keep your opinion out of the classroom, keep whatever, but, I was actually encouraged to model that for them rather than to model smushing that out. I also want to push back a little about statistics and data. And perhaps I come at it from, I do a lot of qualitative research. And that, I took a lot of classes in ed psych. And so a lot of that qualitative, I know all of you are like, yeah. So I have graduate certification in qualitative research. So I also try to encourage students, yes, this is the best information we have. The Department of Labor Statistics is the best information we have. The census is the best information we have. But let's put that in context. For the most of the time that we took a census, you could only choose one race, right? So what happens to people who identify, we used to joke, I had a friend who's biracial, and she's like, oh, every other time I switched, because she's like, I never knew, what to pick. And now, of course, you can pick more than one. And, how do you, there are just so many times where you only have one choice. Right. And keeping in mind, especially as you teach them things like market research, that questions have bias and that the way we ask things have bias. And so therefore the outcomes themselves will have bias. So it's not perfect. It may be the best we have, but I also try to encourage them to sort of see it, from one way, from the way in which it was, from the way in which was taken, and to encourage them to try to do better when they go to gather data. Does that make sense?
Oh, a lot of sense. I loved what you just said there. And it's a good reminder, because no data is, whether it's quantitative or qualitative, like we're always in need of more data. So I like the notion that it's the best that we have, or it's some of the best we have, but there's limitations to all forms of data. So and in learning where, that's why I was saying if students challenge our data set, that's okay. But finding out, I like what you said about how are they informing their thinking? What is the data they would bring? And considering that, but you still might say, I still think this is the best data that I use to teach this. But I don't disagree with that at all. I think it's important to be open to, and as a qualitative researcher, I definitely believe that there's certain things that we can't get the nuanced understanding of larger scale data. Particularly for unique, distinct populations, we have to collect data and ask questions that are often not asked on those larger surveys. So absolutely. I actually think what you just said about you were socialized differently is just the prime example of how it's not a right or wrong. It's just sharing it. Like it's like some people are socialized to share in their field and some aren't. So I just think that's another important thing that you shared.
Dr. Fries-Britt, I had a great conversation yesterday with a group of white men who just graduated from the executive MBA program. Okay. They love their program. They intentionally wanted to meet with me to offer their insight as being white men going through their experience. Okay. It was a fascinating conversation.
I bet. Yeah.
And at the end, they recommend, well, first of all, the points that I took away from them is that while they definitely see, after going through diversity training and even hearing some of the professors who are trying to intentionally, incorporate DEI into the classroom, that they felt that it caused more of a divide and a discord than it did, including, that they felt like that it led to more racial stereotyping, not less. And they felt like that the relationships were treated as a zero-sum power play. I mean, I think that is so important. Now, the thing about it is they all are interested in moving the needle. They recommended, and I've been watching videos ever since they left yesterday. I'm not sure if you're familiar with Chloe Valderi, who founded a course called The Theory of Enchantment. And she was a Wall Street Journal Bartley Fellow. And she teaches around an enchantment, anti-racism approach where the clients are trained to understand complexity and what it means to be human. It's really sort of like a love. It really is about, we're uplifting as opposed to, from the standpoint of, although unintentional, putting one group down while trying to build up another. And I just wanted to just get your sense as to, even if you don't know of Chloe, I mean, I still think, well, that actually is a fascinating concept, that we are on the same journey, but can't we all work together to uplift in this dialogue as opposed to create an experience that actually makes me feel like I am a villain, when in my heart of hearts, I know that I am not that person that people are looking at me just because of the color of my skin.
So I'm not at all familiar with Chloe, but I did make a note and I'll have to look that up. But I'm not at all surprised by the what they shared with you. Sandy and Lena Aston, the Astons at UCLA, did a lot of work on this a number of years ago in their larger survey. The SERP database found that the most dissatisfied group with the engagement of DEI work over the years has been white males. And so that doesn't surprise me, because it actually is an area that for whom it is most discomfort, not a lot of comfort around their experiences with it. Now, I don't know for the guys that you met with, but I'm not surprised by that finding at all. And so, and I haven't looked at that body of scholarship in quite some time, but that kept coming up as the group that consistently on the SERP database, and we could probably look it up and see, because they actually post their data, but they're the most dissatisfied with any of the engagement around diversity issues on college campuses. It may have changed in the last couple of years. I used to, in a couple of our classes, look at that data more regularly. It is, for lots of reasons, I think, can feel very uncomfortable for a lot of our white male students. But I would argue that the way of thinking about how to teach it, and this is where I'm going to give you, and I'll send it to Jeanette. I was mentioning that Dr. Haynes Davis, who works at University of Texas, Charla Haynes Davis, she did a recent study that was published in the journal Diversity in Higher Ed. She went to a college, 600 and some odd folks, down to a small sample, but it was about white racial awareness of professors and how it affects classroom behavior and interaction. And one of the things that I hear in that came out from your male students is that if we gear the teaching to their need without understanding the range of needs of our students and how do we teach these subject matters in ways that not everyone's going to be comfortable. There have been so many ways in which students of color and women in non-traditional fields have been highly uncomfortable in the classroom, highly charged by how the discourse, but we haven't changed it to fit their need necessarily. So I don't think the answer is to fit any, and that doesn't mean that Chloe's work is not great work. It may be great work. I think what we have to think about is a wide range of sensibilities for all of our students, including our white male students. I don't think the answer is that they need to be uncomfortable or one group needs to be uncomfortable, but what are the multiple ways that we might teach and get this feedback from all of our students early enough? So the work out of Sandy Aston's and the work from the SERP database helped people to understand, to be aware that this topic may be different for some of our students in the classroom. And so how do we then think about how to teach it or how to check in with students or how to engage the process is a useful way to think about it. I actually had in my class when I was teaching, I haven't taught in a while because I've been buying out for grants, but I had one white male student. He's a physics major. I found this out later. Actually, long story short, it was in my class, and I was so worried about how uncomfortable he was going to be in my race ethnicity class, because the class is about race and ethnicity. And as it turned out, he felt, and I know this because he's followed up with me, he's in our physics program on campus, he learned so much. And I was thoughtful about how to bring these issues up, and thoughtful for how we were going to engage across the board. And he was the only lone white male in there. And so I think for faculty, be aware, but not to only cater to the needs of any one group is important in the teaching of these topics. But I will check out Chloe's work.
Love that. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. So much work to be done on it, you guys. Plenty of work for us to all make progress.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Any final thoughts that folks have? I think we've gone over about 15 minutes. So
I wanted to just go back to Melanie for a second.
Oh, yes.
Melanie had her hand raised, but then that her question got addressed, but I still wanted to make space just in case you had anything.
Yes, Melanie, what's your wisdom? I know you have a lot.
Thank you, Dr. Fries-Britt. But you actually addressed what I wanted to offer Julie very eloquently. And I just wanted to re-emphasize the fact that that this work is uncomfortable. But I wanted to offer to Julie, who I don't think is any longer with us, that there is a community at Smith that you can actually, surround yourself with as you continue to push so that you can see the fruit of your work. So you addressed it, and thank you for opening the space. I appreciate it.
Well, I'm glad you said that about community, because those communities matter. We have one in our college, and that's who I lean on to refuel when I'm frustrated. So I'm glad you said that. Thank you, you guys, so much. Have a great weekend, everybody.